Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Cole, and I'm honored to be able to welcome you to Nebraska Talks, full service community schools, 3 hours, 3 conversations. My name is Jeff Cole, and I'm network lead for Beyond School Bells. That's Nebraska's expanded learning network and a program of the Nebraska Children and Families Foundation, where it's my honor to serve as an associate vice president for school community partnerships. Nebraska Children and Beyond School Bells are honored to be participating and partnering with the Department of Education's 21st Century Community Learning Center program and Nebraska Extension on this important dialogue focusing on full service community schools, or community schools for short. NCFF is an advocate for community schools here in Nebraska, and we are very excited to kick off today's series of discussions. Let me start with a quick overview of the 3 hours to come. We will begin with a view from the top and why community schools are kind of a common sense work that's so important, especially at this moment, but really as a key strategy for overcoming long-held educational inequities. Then we'll jump into the nitty-gritty details of this site-specific work. For at its core, community schools are all about connecting kids and families to resources in their communities that they need to reach their full potential. We'll discuss what this work looks and feels like from the perspective of community partners and school leaders leading this work here in Nebraska, before we jump back to the state and district level perspective to wrap up our conversation about the vital role that community schools play in the lives of Nebraska's children, families, and communities they serve. Through these conversations, it's our hope that we will gain a better understanding of community schools' value and their importance as a strategy to re-engage and accelerate learning and help districts meet their goals of preparing young people for successful, fulfilling lives. Just a couple of mechanics on questions. We really encourage questions. I'll be moderating that and populate the discussion with those as they come through. So please use the Q&A function on the menu bar at the bottom of your screen to upload any questions you might have. And we will just jump right into this conversation this morning. We're really honored to have 2 distinguished national educational leaders to help us start today's conversation. Dr. Tony Smith is the former superintendent of public schools in Oakland, California, and the Illinois State Superintendent of Education, and is currently an educational consultant working on a range of important education issues nationally. Importantly, Tony is also the board member of the National Coalition for Community Schools and a leading voice for community schools across the country. Tony is going to kick off today's conversation by engaging our very own Commissioner of Education, Dr. Matt Bloomstead. Dr. Bloomstead is a strong advocate for strengthening school community partnerships and has directed some of Nebraska's COVID relief funds to support 4 community school demonstration projects across the state. In addition to leading the Nebraska Department of Education, Dr. Bloomstead is also serving as president of the board of directors of the Council of Chief State School Officers, which is where I believe that he and Tony first connected. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony to get our conversation started. Tony?
Thank you very much, Jeff. It's really a pleasure to be with you and part of Nebraska Talks, and building connections and community is really what I've learned from you, and the depth and story and history that you've shared of the work. It's been amazing. And Matt, before I jump in and start asking questions, I just want to say how much I appreciate your friendship and the stories we've shared and just the work we've done over the years. Definitely helped me as a state chief, and just have deep respect and appreciation for your leadership. So thank you. But just
same here, Tony. So thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's awesome. So just as a broad overview initially, so the idea that we could connect the public system of public schooling with deeper systems in our communities is something that's been around for a long time, right? So the idea that every child gets the need, care, support, high quality education that they deserve, that's a big lift, and our public schools are at the center of that. And really, community schools are the idea that we could, should, and when we're doing our best work as adults, connect all of the public infrastructure, private infrastructure, philanthropy around the assets and needs of children. And as we move into this conversation, we're going to talk about the big idea but actually what that looks like in policy and practice and how you keep coming back to purpose. And with that, Matt, it's something that you've led from, like the idea that, hey, any barrier that's in a kid's way, we should be working to eliminate. We should figure out how to get the inequity out of the system. And I've just so appreciated how you take these problems on in a way that's like, hey, not sure how to solve this, but if we put the needs of children and their families at the center, we can work it out. And if you kind of open by talking about how you see that and why that's kind of at the center and your why, if you will.
Yeah, and once again, just thanks, Tony. One of the things I will say about Tony too. I mean, number one, I miss him among my national peers in that particular work, and it's so often that conversations that Tony and I had then or have now are very much around these very same themes that we have this unique opportunity in education to connect various dots that students have, and there shouldn't be barriers to that, and there often are many artificial barriers. Hey, look, we can't do that, or we tried that once and it didn't work, or whatever the themes may be that create that type of barrier. But our needs persist, right? The needs of our students and our families persist, and constantly it's important that we're thinking about how to overcome those particular barriers. Now, when I was growing up, I mean, I was thinking of all, I had one TV station in, Southwest rural Nebraska in our little community, and it was PBS, right? I mean, so like many of us, I'm sure sat there and watched Sesame Street, and like, who were the people in your neighborhood? I felt this great connection to the notion at the earliest of years to knowing who we're surrounded with. And often that's family, but often your family gets extended in your community in many different ways, and you rely on them. Like I grew up in a large family, and so if we wandered off, or one of my siblings wandered off, you hoped that someone could, help track them down. And, never thought of the world as a dangerous place, right, for children or otherwise. And we know that's not necessarily true. We have lots of concerns that we would have, but growing up watching like a Sesame Street and going, who are the people in your neighborhood? I experienced that. I also connected in a lot of different ways that when I would go to Kansas City, where I had an aunt that taught in inner city Kansas City, I'd go there and I realized that's the same neighborhood. And again, at the earliest of years, I felt that connection between community and myself, and community and seeing and observing what was really good for children. And then I just got reinforced time and time again throughout my career that that's a basic theme, a basic human need, that people are connected there. And we actually create somewhat artificial barriers in serving our students and our families because we say, well, that's not our work. Not my responsibility about whether or not that family has what they need to eat, right? I mean, it's like, oh yeah, absolutely it is. And we know that doing that work together is really so important. Or safety, security, just the notion that we do all this together is really important. And so what we've tried to build in Nebraska, what I want to continually build on, is that kind of natural sense of community that's already there. And instead of seeing any of that as a barrier, that we turn a corner and say those partnerships, even though sometimes really hard work to figure out how to do it and how to do it well with a lot of different financial resources and otherwise, but it comes down to that basic principle that we can do that together and we can overcome those particular barriers. So it doesn't matter if it's academics, doesn't matter if it's feeding kids, it doesn't matter if it's ensuring that parents really know the services that are available to them in a community. If we do that collectively and we understand that better, you don't have to have all the answers. And I love to say, my favorite saying, I think it's in my high school yearbook, by the way, it says, Matt's favorite saying is, I don't know. And I still stick with that because so often I don't know. But if you start with, I don't know, and you're willing to take a step forward and go and admit to that, humbly admit to that, and take steps forward and go, but I can find you the answer, or I can find a way that we can find an answer together. I think it's just an empowering thing rather than a debilitating thing in any way. So I just have that personal philosophy, Tony. You know that about me, but we have to drive towards those things that are best for kids, and I think in this work we can really continue to do that.
Yeah, man, I appreciate that so much. There are a few things, and I knew you would organically basically articulate the 4 pillars of community schools is just in you. And then this other piece about
By the
the
way, Tony,
learning.
my memory's never good on those things. So if I don't really know it or believe it, I can't articulate it. So
Right. Well, that's great because it's you, it's who you are. But the other piece of it, right, is the creating the conditions where, what do you do when you don't know what to do? And the importance of having community and deep learning. And I think as educators, like that's what we've kind of always taken the stand, that we need to prepare young people to be ready for things that they don't know or understand, and meet it with humility and their best thinking and skills. And so that, again, the context of a community school is really about an engaged community and some of the stories that you were sharing, right? So that the idea of expanded learning, that learning is happening everywhere all the time, and how and in what ways we kind of, eliminate bias and barriers and create more opportunities. So expanded learning, the idea of engaging community, right? Community partnerships, parent-family engagement, integrated student support, so high quality teaching, getting high quality food, like all these opportunities, connecting the dots, and then collaborative leadership, that we actually share responsibility, which means kind of transforming some of the relationships that have existed before. So those 4 pillars are what create the idea of a community school, and it can be anywhere, anytime. There's no like you have to do all these things. It's knowing the assets and strengths of your children and also their needs, and that's how you organize. So I guess in your leadership at this point, as you think about community schools being a more specific strategy to support some of the rural communities across Nebraska, how are you thinking about supporting from the department those districts and leading this conversation?
Number one, I mean, certainly mindset, right? I mean, we hope that over the years, what we've built around even what we call AQuest, it's not really our accountability system, it's actually our framework in which we engage communities and families to ensure that our students have the best resources available. But really, one of the things I think that really just emphasizes where we're at is in the midst of the pandemic, right? So it takes all hands on deck, so to say, and that was always true in education. I think that's one of the things that folks kind of a really heightened and have a heightened understanding of right now, is it just takes all of those particular features and again, maybe back to mindset of don't be limited. Like there were so many folks, I mean, educators are notorious for, and me too on some cases, I always say I'm the world's worst bureaucrat, but yet it's part of my job, right? You're supposed to check certain boxes, get certain things done. Well, what we're trying to do is create many pathways to the right answer at a local level, right? Instead of saying, hey, look, here's the one way you're going to accomplish that, we have this notion of here's a philosophy. If you know what the children need in your community, and that means that it's engaging, your food and nutrition folks with others because that's your biggest need, there's a community solution to that. If you know that you have a whole bunch of students not engaged and not understanding, kind of key principles in your academic setting, there's a whole community that can help you with that. If you know that you have students that are suffering trauma and dealing with things that at a family level, that it doesn't all fall on the school. There's a whole community for that. And so I want people to really be thinking, and we're trying to organize in such a fashion, working certainly with the Children and Families Foundation, but working with all the partners that come underneath the umbrella, that there's a solution for the problem that you have if you think about this not being solved necessarily in the school or by a teacher or by one person, but that you are able to tap into a network that exists statewide to address that issue. Because most likely, even though it might be a unique problem all of a sudden for you or your community, it's probably not a unique struggle or challenge for the community that we have more broadly in the state, and frankly, even across the nation. And so when you place yourselves at a point of there will always be a solution for this challenge, you will find it. If you place yourself, so this is too big of a challenge for me to take on, and that's always going to be true too. One person doesn't solve those things, but collectively we're able to do that. One school can't do what this kind of philosophy around community can do for those students, and one community can't do what is necessary for all the families and children without that sense of community. And so what we're trying to do from a statewide level is, number one, model those behaviors. So a lot of it is, hey, look, we build partnerships. And again, partnerships take a lot of work when you're talking about government money, right? I mean, it takes contracts, it takes, describing it to one of my things, describing it to the U.S. Department of Education. Tony, you'll appreciate that. Getting people to understand what you're really trying to accomplish. Because if you try to make it, I'm going to do this one thing, that one thing isn't enough for this type of approach to addressing the types of challenges, the types of needs that families and otherwise face. And one of it for me, just, frankly, we get very fixated on the academic side. And if you say, well, I'm just worried about the academics, the other things can't fall by the wayside because your academics will as well. So this kind of web of interconnectivity between everything that happens in a child's life is so critical. We know that. Doesn't mean we can solve it on our own. I get some people going, well, schools just can't solve all those things. Absolutely true. And that's the very point of this work, is that we know that. And this is an approach and a model to drive towards the capacities that are necessary to take on those particular challenges. So, and we'll keep working on it. Like, hey, Tony, back to I don't know. There's so many things that we're willing to do and organized to do, and we will go do that with our partners, because we can find someone that can do something that we can't, and then they can bring some other resource to the table that we hadn't even thought of yet. And so that's got to be our mindset. It's got to be the mindset in a school setting as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Matt. And for me, I talked about the creative courage that requires to both to bring what you do know, but also be really open to the things that you don't, and that again, back to community, that there's deep wisdom and understanding in local community to solve problems. So it's not just seeing the problem from the outside and thinking I have the right answer. It's getting in relationship, bringing what you do know to the table, and then figuring out how to solve those problems for the strengthening of the community. And I would say, back to this idea that a healthy, strong, vibrant public school is really at the heart of a healthy community, and that the community school context for us, I think, as practitioners, has been about really knitting and connecting and making sure that no child is alone. Like, really, this notion of social emotional learning and connectivity and belonging, like, that's a community school commitment, so that deep learning can happen, so that the community gets stronger, the region gets stronger, and in your case, Nebraska gets stronger. So if you could just talk to me a little bit about how you're thinking about connecting, the different agencies, health and human services, mental health, like the bigger picture of agencies around this idea of a really specific strategy. But there's a context in Nebraska, there's policy, there's leadership from the legislature. It's really extraordinary context, and you've been knitting and weaving that together statewide, very much like a community school coordinator does locally. You've been kind of doing that at the macro level. If you could talk about that a little bit, I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's really true. And I was just thinking about the dynamics of trust, and these are tumultuous times in a lot of different ways, and the dynamics of relationships and trust and expectations. And I'll just tell a story on myself. I just flew out to Chadron. I'm on the board of trustees for the state college system, right? And so it's really an honor to be able to be part of that. I'm on, I don't know, I think I'm 30 boards and commissions or something like that, Tony. You know how that goes, right? I mean, in these roles, you get asked to do a lot of different things. Well, this is one where I'm there because there's this history of needing to train teachers in the state, right? I mean, and all that history kind of comes together, and you have all that context. Well, so I have to go to a meeting in Chadron, right? And just, they decided to take the state plane. So I was able to that because I originally we were going to be in person, right, for this particular meeting, but there's, a lot of trust that takes place. Like, do I know what the pilot's training was? Do I understand what the maintenance schedule was for the airplane? This is a small, like 7-seat plane that we're flying across. And it's one of those things. I'm sure as a kid, I would have thought, well, what a remarkable thing. It's like, well, you have to have a lot of trust, not just in the kind of the system overall, right? I mean, because that means I'm trusting somebody at FAA. That means I'm trusting somebody in lots of levels of government. I'm trusting that at Chadron they have a runway that is, going to function well. I'm trusting that again, everything along the way, you have to kind of establish that level of trust. And so one of the things that we fall into often is, well, I don't trust government to do that, or I don't trust government to do that, or I don't trust, the school to do that for us, or I don't trust whatever it may be. If you don't start kind of with this webbing of trust and relationships, which, by the way, is definition of community, and you sit there and you web all those things together, and it takes a lot of work, right? So anybody who's thinking about what's their relationship with their coworkers, what's your relationship, all that stuff takes work. And so we're doing the same thing, right? So we're doing the same thing at the Department of Education, that we try to make sure that there's a relationship, I mean, to the personal level, at every level, with other agencies, whether it's HHS, whether it's economic development, whether it's Department of Labor, wherever it is. And there's a history of mistrust among all the types of entities that are there. And not because there was a reason to have mistrust. Maybe there was, maybe there's something that happened, and you break up with the relationship that you had in that sense. But if you don't work on that, there's a reason for this, right? I can't do my job if I view it only as this sector of the work. If I only worried about education in the state of Nebraska, first of all, I wouldn't get my job done because we have other responsibilities. But if I just viewed, that's it, I'm just going to worry about that, and I'm going to wash my hands of anything else and say we don't have to do that. But instead, if I think of our role as a leader in that system, and I'll just take state government, then I say, well, now I'm suddenly interested in what happens in economic development and how's that connect to the work in education. And then I'm suddenly interested in making sure that we're serving, folks that are in, working with Department of Labor, right? And, workforce development generally. And we can see those connections pretty easily in education, but sometimes those partners don't see those connections, right? It actually takes a relationship to be able to tie that together. Now, admittedly, sometimes you got to formalize relationships, right? You got to sometimes say, we're really dedicated to this. And you use, contracts and other things, and we certainly do that as well. But it really comes down to, hey, look, we're going to keep trying on these things. And we get frustrated, just like anyone else in relationships, right? You get frustrated. They're not hearing us. They're not, maybe they're not trusting us. And so you keep working at it. And one of the things that sustains us is kind of building that culture again of trust and relationships between places that you don't normally think do that work. And I'll just tell, people over and over and over again, government is people work, right? I mean, the reality is, and regardless, and at a community level, when you're trying to accomplish something, it's about people. You turn around and you do that. And then it's like also about engaging, and back to trust. If I can have a trusting relationship at a state level, that's a model for a regional level or a community, a county level, right? If I can work with Department of Labor here, schools at a local level can do that. Sometimes they provide me the better model, quite frankly. But it's like, when you start to see that come together, it's a very powerful thing. We have to continue that work. And one of the things, certainly, and back to with Children and Families Foundation. So part of the relationship that I have there is established because of the work that they were doing to establish relationships with Health and Human Services over the years to provide other types of services. And so, you also welcome yourself to someone else's table on occasion, and you have to be humble enough to sit there and learn from what their experiences were. And so, again, that's the philosophy. If we know everything that we ought to do, that sounds great. We rarely know everything we need to do. And instead, we take the time to engage in that relationship building and that trust building. And then from that develops really meaningful work that you can say, oh, if I thought, we could connect that grant to this activity. And we've done a lot of that. So much of that, I hope anyway, a model not just for others in Nebraska, but I hope across the country.
Well, and I think it is. I think again, it goes from your leadership and the leadership in the legislature to get it in these ideas in policy, and but connecting to a core purpose and the practice that's in the field and in community in Nebraska, and then your ability to talk about it nationally and be an example. So I do think it's important for folks who are in the webinar today just to understand that you are talking about and leading from the work in Nebraska on a national stage too. So just to say, this notion of trust that you are talking about, I think you're earning it and building it nationally for the deep work that's happening in Nebraska. And there's an interesting stance and distinction, and maybe this is a little bit too much of a push, but I do think there are state leaders that start from trust, and I would put you in that category, and others that start from distrust, that the local systems are not doing what they should. And I happen to believe that if you start with trust, that those places that maybe aren't will reveal themselves. But if you start with distrust, you basically constrain and harm the entire system. And I think you've led from trust, and the idea that we have to coordinate, align, and leverage every resource for the well-being of children. And that's kind of guiding your action and behaving in trustworthy ways. So when you're connecting those dots and doing that, if you could talk a little bit about maybe some of the local experiences you've had and what you've seen and maybe learned from, about how some of those locals have helped you maybe take a direction in the state that's kind of helped get some of this in writing and get it codified in policy, maybe a few local examples.
Yeah, and I think of this, and I've done over my interesting career, I'll call it that, different kind of moments in time, and I find myself like I fell into conversations. It was at the time it was the Rural Development Commission. It was underneath clear back to Governor Nelson. So in the early 90s, right? I mean, in his time as governor. And I kind of fell into it where there was this real sense of how do you do community and community building, and that's really where I got my interest from kind of an economic development and community development perspective. Well, I don't know if I got my interest there, but I enhanced my interest at that time, and I thought there, kind of fall into those things, and I have this friend that would often talk about if you go into a community and you help them with the problems they think they have, they might even let you help them with the problems you think they have. And it's that, again, a little bit of the humility, and you have to set that aside, set your own ego aside, and set your own biases, I would even say, aside, to understand what's happening in that community. And when we don't do that well, whether it's the department or state government or federal government, you're not respected. You're not going to be, welcome. And by the way, we still struggle with this because we got pressures. You go in and you have a job you're supposed to do. Anytime you send auditors into a place, they're really happy to see you. I'm sure of it. So how do you balance all of those kind of have to do's, and pull off some get to do's in those particular moments? The difference, I think, that we're trying to accomplish, right, holistically, is not just that we're able to do that, because we have to be able to go in and criticize at the right moment. And it's not about trust. It's about, constructive, here are things that we're observing and how can we be helpful and how do you offer those supports. But if the first time you walk into a community was with that criticism in hand, it's really tough. And I'm going to admit, I've made those mistakes, in this job, because we're under certain pressures that you have to go do certain things and you're going to walk in and do that. But the flip side of that is, how do we start? And that's where a real big push for me right now is, how do we start and go into schools and say, what else can we do? I mean, we're in the historic moments of the pandemic. I don't think I'm not gonna say I understand what's happening or what their needs are, because I don't feel like I've been able to do that work yet, right? And so we're going to turn that corner and start thinking about how to do that. But we've been in places, where we go in and work, and in some of these places actually are on our list of schools, that we're now working more deeply with in the community school work. So we have to go in with the mindset that we're quote unquote there to help. And I got Tony, you'll love this one, because a school superintendent one time, early, maybe not early, maybe mid 2-3 years into my time, he's like, well, Matt, there's the two biggest lies in the state of Nebraska are this. And it's like the commissioner of education comes into the superintendent's office and the commissioner says, I'm here to help you. Well, the biggest lie, Tony, and this is the part I like, I've heard that joke many a time, right?
Yeah.
The biggest lie is the superintendent says to the commissioner of education, I'm glad to see you. So, we want to be in a position where they're really glad to see the department and see others. And also, same thing for a school, right? If a school doesn't really have open doors to the community and someone comes in and says, hey, look, I'm here to find a way to help you, you better be ready to honestly say, I'm glad to see you. And I think for us, that's very much the work that's going to happen in our schools and our communities. We have to go in Nebraska, we identify priority schools underneath our model. I always wanted it to be
Where did you
about
send it to me?
going in and making sure that the priority is that school for us, right? Our priority is not about anything but helping them get done what they know they want to do. I've never gone into a school in Nebraska that wants to struggle with anything, right? They actually need help in certain ways, and if we can actually provide some of that help, I think that's good. So
Thank you, Matt.
somebody has a mic on somewhere,
I think that's right. So if we can make sure that we mute, that would be helpful. Thank you. So Matt, I think this is a good transition point to the voice. And so when, as a state leader, every single kid in your care deserves quality education, and connecting all the dots and creating the conditions for kids to thrive is what you lead for and from. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about those kids and families that aren't experiencing success, and how you think your responsibility and the leadership in the state needs to be paying attention to folks who haven't had the best experience yet, and that the common good and the future and health and well-being of Nebraska, it's going to take everybody. I mean, it's not a zero-sum game. And how do you create more solidarity, more opportunity, more deep learning and support for kids and families that haven't experienced it yet?
Yeah, it's really important. And the thing that immediately comes to my mind is really about systems involved youth across the state, right? Those that are experienced somehow, and whether it's in the foster care system, child welfare system, like generally, juvenile justice. And so there's unfortunately for many of those children, they've been disengaged in the most extreme way that we really experience. And then there's not necessarily that sense of community around them. There's a lot of people trying really hard to figure out how to serve them and serve them well. But my observation of that is that it's happening in isolation from the rest of the system in many ways. And so, and we present some really bad incentives in the system for addressing children that are highly mobile, especially those that are highly mobile in the system, in any of the systems involved kids. I mean, if they're in foster care and they're getting bounced around, we haven't really figured out how to build that real sense of community around those that are doing that. And they come into schools, and schools care deeply about each kid that's going to come in there, but they also, human, remember, it's a human. What do you do when you can't manage the tragedy, the challenges, right? You actually put up barriers to understand. I mean, I do it, you do it, we all do it. You put up a barrier because it's too much of a challenge. It's too difficult for that to be solved. And every time I run into something that's too difficult to be solved by me, my first thing is to look around and go, who else do we have with us on this. I mean, who else will take on that particular work? And so children that have that are disengaged, and whether or not they're in the foster care system or not, it's that same thing, because it's really, really hard, right? It's sometimes hard because maybe there's a family that doesn't want to be engaged, and that you're trying to provide them that type of assistance. And I think part of it for us is to keep trying and to offer, the fullest extent of that. And by the way, some kids aren't going to go connect in school in the way that we would hope would be, successful for them. And so how do we use our partners in this work? Certainly in Nebraska with Beyond School Bells and all of our 21st century, it's a network of surprising, remarkable, innovative ideas and people that begin to specialize in that work. And we shouldn't think of it as separate from the rest of the system, but part of, right? And I think that's the real unique thing. It's because we can find innovations for one family, or kind of maybe one moment in time. Like, I mean, this is where I think, like, after school is this, hey, look, we got from, pick a time, 3:30 to 6 o'clock or whatever, whatever time frame. And you think, well, I'm going to solve everything in that time frame. Well, that's not enough either, right? Because we have to think about the rest of it. And so, but how do we, almost like a relay, it's like someone's handing something else off, but you're intentionally doing that, and you're doing that well. I know as children go through lots of different, environments, I mean, they're getting bounced around, and perhaps their situations aren't great. I mean, if they know, a child who knows, hey, look, I can go to school, and that person knows that they can safely get me to the next place, and I'm going to go to the next place. And then ideally, that loop is understood all the way back around, and what happened in that setting that's going to help you with, your maybe traditional school setting, or going to help you with the relationships that you need to have, is the ideal for us. And I know this is happening all the time. Schools need this help. I think that's also a difference maybe from, say, 20 years ago, that we accept that we can't do it all, right? And I think that's actually a hard thing, again, for educators to accept. That it's like we really have done remarkable things in the education system across this country, but we have to accept that we can't pull all that off on our own. And how do we continue to establish that at a family level? I'm absolutely convinced, Tony, that we spend a lot of time on worrying about academic achievement. We spend a lot of time worrying about how students are doing. Those are good benchmarks, things to measure, but it's not the sole purpose of an education system. I think often about we see all sorts of challenges all over the world. But I remember listening a few years ago. It must have been on the NPR story, because I'm usually like listening to something as I'm driving, so it's probably was something like that. But they talked about in like a war-torn country, right? Some places had in Afghanistan comes to mind just in the sense of this. What's the first thing that communities do? They settle in after they get anything that's just a little bit of presence of stability. They try to educate their next generation, right? And that's universal. Go into historically universal too, right? You go there and you find that you're trying, whatever your sense of community is. It's obviously not been a perfect world. But when you go there and you find that sense of community, whether it's the family unit itself or otherwise, they're trying to provide a better opportunity for the next generation. And that's what our work is, right? It's like, that is truly what our work is. And when I see people kind of point fingers, well, this didn't work over here, this didn't work over here, it's because we aren't working together. Anytime you're not pointing fingers, anytime you're pointing fingers means you aren't shaking hands, right? It's like you've got to get together to figure out how you're going to solve that intractable problem, if you think it's an intractable problem, and you can't give up on it. And there's a lot of people that point fingers. That's the easiest thing to do in society, is to say, oh, you aren't getting this done and you aren't getting this done. The best thing we can do is go, hey, look, I see you're struggling with that. What could I do to help? How do we do that? And we need that relationship constantly in a productive society, in my view. So
Yeah, well, you remind me of some of the sayings as a boy and like growing up in a small community, like that, anybody can burn down a barn. It's really hard to build one.
yeah, exactly.
Like you can't simultaneously wring your hands and roll up your sleeves. Let's roll up our sleeves and get to it. Like all of like, I mean, it's folksy and it's just true. And that work it takes, the trying and the doing. I think the thing I just have deep respect and appreciation for you, Matt, in particular, is that as a leader, you show up with this willingness to try and like, hey, it doesn't take brilliance, it takes grinding and it takes staying at it and it takes being consistent and it takes, being humble and all the things you've talked about in terms of your leadership. And I think this question of getting barriers out of the way, when you talk about innovation, so for me, I define innovation by the elimination of bias and creation of opportunity. If we can do that in, it's not a tech thing, it's in all things. Like if we can be disciplined in eliminating bias and expanding opportunity for children, like when everybody's doing better, everybody's going to do better. If all of the young people are getting the education they deserve in Nebraska, Nebraska is going to be economically, civically, and socially stronger. So how in this next phase of your leadership and the implementation of community schools a little more broadly, how are you thinking about talking about like the getting kids like this expanded learning, like learning's happening everywhere all the time? How's that going to count? Getting maybe outside of some of the time stuff you were talking about, like it doesn't just happen in the after school or in school, but this bigger idea of kids across the state getting what they need to be successful academically and socially. Like, how are you really thinking about that in the next phase?
Yeah, a couple things come to mind, and maybe in my folksy way, but I'm like one thing, and I talk about this with our team, especially on addressing achievement gap, and I'm like kind of tired of admiring the problem, right? I mean, so you sit there and go, okay, we see that we have this, and I mean, I don't think there's anyone out there. I don't have to remeasure that problem over and over and over again. I actually can pretty well predict where those problems are. So it's really time to get about the work of figuring out what's going to best move us forward as a state, as a education system. And I'm absolutely convinced of this, that it's about engagement. So you can tell when there's learning happening. I have some amazing educators that I got to be around in the department and across the state. And you can walk in and go, hey, that's really working. You can feel it because the kids are engaged, and you see teachers that understand how to engage. And so there's a science to all of that I think is extremely important. And so we can't let that part of it suffer in the midst of the other things I'm going to talk about. But the reality is we know actually how to do that and how to do that pretty well. So we can measure student learning in a pretty effective way across the state on a pretty narrow set of activities, right? I mean, it's not everything. I don't know how to measure engagement, right? And so someone's always going to want to come back and say, well, we want measurable outcomes for these things. And I'm like, well, if we are able to demonstrate that you go out and engage children in a meaningful way that provides relevance for their environment and addresses the challenges that they may face as learners or as people generally, you can actually move the dial on these measures that do matter in education, right? I mean, that we get focused on, and we admire the problem and all those things on that side of the equation. I'm also just absolutely convinced on the other side of the problem thing is we shouldn't adopt solutions to other people's problems, right? And so we do this so often. So one, admire the problem. The other is adopt a set of solutions that we think absolutely work. And we get hit all the time with show us the evidence that that strategy is going to work. And I get worried because if I only did things, if we, as a society, if we only did things that we knew would work, we would be frozen. We could go nowhere. We can never learn something more, because that is not a level of humility that we need. And instead, it actually comes back to that distrust, right? So if I'm going to say anything you do, here's how I'm going to measure you. I'm going to measure you by number one, that you see growth at the end of this, right? Growth in learning, growth in whatever you want to call it. But I'm going to measure you on growth, which is the right way to look at it. We're going to get improvement. We're going to measure that improvement and go forward. But the first thing I want you to do is prove to me that it's going to work before you do it. Then why would you measure it? I don't need to measure something that I know is going to work. I have proof, by the way, in early childhood settings that is going to make a difference in the long-term outcomes for students. I have proof in an education system that if you have engaged students, that they're going to do better, right? I don't need proof, because there's evidence galore for that. So what I need is the focus on the energy on the front end of that system instead of the back end of that system. And we put, if you look at the single largest check we write across the Department of Education, probably true for almost every state education agency, is that check you write to your assessment company. Because that's what we're having to do at the back end of this. Now, I'm not saying that's not important. I'm actually a huge proponent of making sure that we can do those measures. But if our focus becomes that, you have missed your opportunity already. You set yourself up to admire the problem, which we got to get over. But if you put your energy on the front end of the theory of action side, right, that we know this is going to make a difference, and longitudinally, those are the only ways you can tell whether or not these things actually function and work. So I'm not going to be able to measure year by year, but I can start to measure growth, all right, and understand that from an academic sense. But most importantly, I can measure engagement. Measure engagement if you have opportunities for students to engage in, and at least you know that they're doing that, and parents to engage in. And you can measure it observationally by knowing that students are more deeply engaged, families are more deeply engaged. And that's what we get in this partnership, Tony. I mean, that's what we get in a way that's truly meaningful. It's from our 21st century, my best parental engagement is because of 21st century across the state. I don't have any other great way to measure that anywhere else, but in 21st century, we have that. And so how do we learn from that? How do we help schools learn from that? As a country, how do we learn from that? And I think that's the opportunity in front of us, that we continue to do that and do that well.
Boy, there's so much in there, Matt. I mean, again, the fact that Nebraska's got you at the center of this conversation is really extraordinary. I mean, I think the willingness to hold big ideas, so Isadora Duncan, the great dancer, used to say, if I could say it, I wouldn't have to dance. Right? And so, I mean,
you always have a better way of putting things than me. I don't know. That's why I need you, Tony. That's why I need you all the time. So.
Well, no, but it's just that extraordinary thing about young people. Are you more or less interested after this? Are you more or less capable of doing it after we just did this? Do you have deeper and better relationships after we did this? There are just some basic questions that by, being just human beings, being people together, asking those deeper questions, that's what's actually valuable, right? And that sense of, this place welcomes me and wants me to be here and wants me to be successful, goes a long way to helping kids be successful. And the more we're having that conversation and creating that context, that's where, to me, communities know they have deep wisdom, and the opportunity for communities to get the support they need to give kids what they all want, which is a high quality education, deep care, so the kids are healthy, their community's healthy. I mean, I think that's what's so powerful about where you've been and really where you're headed, that the common good of Nebraska is kind of rooted in this idea of community schools, connecting all the dots, all the agencies, people, Nebraska together for Nebraska kids is what's going to make the future better. So maybe in the last few minutes we have, if this all goes well in the next 5 years, we come out of one of the most extraordinarily punishing and harmful times in our history. What's true in 5 years from now? How does community schools play out, and what's true for the future of Nebraska?
Yeah, and number one, and again, I don't know that I can figure out how we measure this, but I think we could observe it at least, is that there is an increasing amount of trust between schools and partners and the state, the whole system. There's an increasing amount of trust that should take place, and part of that trust means that you don't have policies that are based on, like we talked before, mistrust. And so by the way, we want guardrails, so to say. It's like, hey, look, you don't want it to fall off completely. I need to make sure certain things are happening and functioning well. But again, back to my point about hopping on an airplane with a pilot that I don't know his background, really nice guy. I know lots of really nice guys. It's like going in for surgery. That surgeon, is a really, nice lady. But is she? I don't know what's the background, right? I mean, you want some credentials, right? And so we want teachers to have some credentials. We want leaders to have some credentials. But after you get past that part of it, because it's supposed to be trust enhancing, right? And instead we end up in this environment where there's kind of everything's built on lack of trust. Just because it's easier for me to put it in the context of, I think, what we experienced in the last year. It took me a long time. I was out there a lot, Tony, saying to schools, trust me, I'm not going to hold you accountable for these things because I know that's beyond your control, and focus your energy on, keeping kids safe, getting them engaged, doing these things. And invariably, everybody's calling and saying, how do I check this box to make sure I don't get in trouble? How do I check this box to make sure So if we can shift our energy in this period of time to be thinking about what are the trusting things that we can do, a level of accountability that comes from an internal place versus an external place, right? I mean, it's like, that is the optimum that I think we can accomplish. I think in 5 years' time that, I would love, if I want to do the top down push, I would say everyone needs a relationship with their Beyond School Bells, 21st Century Program, early childhood, you throw the whole mix into it and go, I want you to prove that you have those relationships. What if in 5 years, what we actually see is everyone's scrambling to ask me how to get those relationships built and supported? Like if I was spending all of my time worried about figuring out how we get that engagement in the places that need that most, and that every family is demanding that they have a chance for those levels of engagement, not because they're upset, but because they just know that's the best particular approach. And I think we're starting to turn that corner. There's some places like I've seen that, and I'll use early childhood as an example. So 20 years ago, when I'm working with rural schools across the state, they're like, we don't want to have to deal with that. We don't want that. And now I have people knocking on our door, help us figure out how to get this done, right? And I think that's what we need to see around the community school model, that people are knocking on our door, knocking on on one another, saying, how did you do it in your community? What did we get done? And that we have a system of supports that are going to make that happen across the state. And I don't think that's a pipe dream at all for us. I think the reality is that that puts us in a position of moving forward for this chance of a true engagement in a way with communities in such a fashion that just move the state forward, move education forward, move communities forward. And we're just so close to it. I can feel that we're moving in the right direction. If there's some things that we really have to measure along the way, we actually have some mechanisms. We're trying to do that within our accountability system, quite frankly, is not to hold them accountable for doing it, but ask them how they're doing it. How are you doing these things? And I think we'll learn so much in that particular work. So it's a wonderful time. I've told people I don't think there's a better time in our lives to do this work. And by the way, we don't get a choice about any of that anyway. So this is always the best time to do this work, Tony. So.
Right, we're here now and take responsibility for doing the very best we can. I think the idea of dreaming that future and not just surviving the present, but actually holding a vision of more deeply connected young people and communities as a result of really support like you're talking about, rather than the punishment approach, to really come in with the deep support that local communities need and to really strengthen that that public school at the center of healthy community. I think that's really where we're headed. It's your leadership. And again, I have tremendous gratitude for the work that you do, Matt, and our friendship, and appreciate your leadership so much, and the way you're knitting it all together and being kind of just publicly transparent and public about how you're learning and where you're not, but also where you're hoping to get, I think is a great context for the community school work in Nebraska. And appreciate this time together. And
Tony, I'm gonna say one of these things. Earlier, you said, it doesn't take brilliance, and that's the one thing I prove over and over again. I don't have. I love education. I love people in this. To see those things come together. I mean, that's what we're. That's the best outcomes come because people care, and the reality is we're doing so much of that. There's so many people that really do care, and it's like unifying in a sense of feeling safe enough to do the work is part of it. And if that's my job as a leader, that's what I'm going to continue to do. So.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate that, the bravery and the courage and the risk taking. So it's not always safe, and the fact that you are courageous and putting out there a vision that is different and more and richer and fuller, and that every young person could and should have what they need and deserve, is a powerful and important leadership for a much healthier Nebraska, right? But also a healthier country. So thank you very much, Matt. And I think
Thanks,
we'll hand
Tony.
it back to Jeff.
Well, yeah, we'll jump in there and add my thanks to both of you, Matt, Tony, and the 87 folks who were able to join us on this morning's conversation. It's a great way to start the dialogue we're going to have around community schools. Commissioner Bloom said, thank you again for your clear, I think, common sense vision of the necessity of broad school community partnerships at both the state and local levels that are necessary, for all youth to succeed, together with this role for the department and the value of networks, but also for your humility and realizing that it has to be locally directed and generated and creative. More broadly, thank you for your dedicated, future-oriented, kind of roll up your sleeves and reach out your hands and trust leadership during the challenges of this unprecedented and continuing global pandemic. We're super lucky to have you and fortunate to have both you and Tony kicking off this important conversation today. So